So very excited for today's Rebels of the Heart episode with Professor Richard Bilodeau. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Derek. It's great to be here today.
Yeah, it's a fun day. I'm looking forward to this episode. We had a really awesome panel conversation in New England there a few months back before the holidays. And we just had a fun conversation that went a lot over a lot of different topics that are pertinent to the Rebels of the Heart community. So I'll just kind of start. I would love for you to share a bit. I mean, you have an interesting career in the sense that you're both a teacher formally
Mhm.
and an entrepreneur, and you've done a lot of different things in that journey. How has that kind of shown up for you as being a quote unquote rebel with a heart?
Well, it's funny. I started life thinking I wanted to be a chemist,
Huh.
and I ended up studying medical technology and laboratory science and worked in a hospital lab for a number of years and then did clinical research for a couple of years. And that really made me feel like I was making a contribution and the work seemed rewarding, helping people figure out what their health ills are. And then
Oh,
hopefully some smart doctors can solve them. But unfortunately, a lot of the work I did became automated. Technology intervened and instruments started to replace the manual science. And I found myself really standing in front of a machine, babysitting it, which was not that rewarding.
mm,
So I decided to have a second career in business. My first love was marketing. And I'm a big fan of thinking about the marketing function and, in particular, how it relates to understanding people. And one of the things I love about research, both clinical research and marketing research,
yeah.
is just about figuring out how things work. And from there, I got interested in entrepreneurship, started a couple of companies. They've been successful and around for a couple of decades. And I had an opportunity 7 years ago to teach full time. I'd been teaching for about 11 years prior to that part time. And I was like, you know what? What better way to help spread the word about all the interesting parts of marketing and entrepreneurship than being a college professor? So
Yeah.
it's just been this great journey. I get to share my successes and my failures and help people figure out, how they're going to make a difference in the world. And
Mm,
so I find it to be both rewarding and challenging, and every day is new. That's one of the things I love about teaching. Different than chemistry,
yeah.
every day was kind of the same. And teaching, every day it's new, which is a real opportunity. And I love doing it.
Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting to me about being in the classroom, you have such opportunities to talk about things that we don't really learn along the way, like empathy and compassion and sustainability and resilience. And so I look at my own teaching as being so much more than simply, here's your marketing class. Let's learn about, the marketing mix and segmentation,
Yeah.
targeting, positioning. I really look at it as how do we broaden our own human experience
Yeah.
through what we decide to take on as work, and how do we make sure we build things that last and that people want, and we do it with integrity, and we think about society and the environment. So there's just so many things we could be doing in the world to
Yeah.
improve our human existence that teaching has become the way in which I'm trying to contribute to those areas.
Well said. So I want to, you kind of had a very nice tee up to my question I was already pondering. Going back a moment to your transition from chemistry and manufacturing research, how did what prompted or how talk about the transition into business other than just not feeling fulfilled? Like what was
Sure. So
that transition like? Yeah.
that transition was an interesting one. So, I was working in a part of the lab where part of what we did was diagnostic and part of what we did was research. One of the things that's unfortunate about clinical research, only the interesting things are really bad for people on the other end of them. So, if I was diagnosing or helping figure out how to diagnose a really bad tumor, that was really bad for the person who had the tumor. And all the stuff that was good news was really routine. And so I think there was a lot of, I was starting to have that psychological impact of, well, I feel like I'm making a difference, but the only things at work that actually are interesting are related to a bad outcome for someone else. And, I'm just going through the motions with the stuff that's routine. And so I sat down one day. I remember I took myself to a local coffee shop and I said, I'm going to make a list of all the things I like about my job.
Yeah.
And the funniest thing when I read through that list, I'm like, I could have any job. I
Huh.
don't need to be doing the job I'm doing right now. I could have any job. I'm interested in interacting with people. I'm interested in figuring things out. I'm interested in starting things. I'm interested in experimenting and tinkering. And for me, it was like a real wake up call. I think up until that moment in time in my life, I thought, well, I'm always going to be a scientist of sorts.
Mhm.
Um, and then I was like, well, I'm taking some business classes because I'm managing a section of the lab.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out how I get better at things like accounting and marketing and operations because I'm a practitioner. I'm not really a manager, but I really like business. So, I took a leap of faith. I went back to school, got some additional education, completed some more undergraduate training, and then did an MBA. And I just basically decided that right before I was getting my MDA, I quit my hospital job
Yeah.
and just took a leap of faith. I became a graduate assistant. One of the things that I often laugh about now, granted, this was a long time ago, but still it wasn't much money. I somehow managed to live on $8,000 a year for 2 years because
Wow.
that's what my graduate stipend was. And so, I occasionally took part time work. I tried
Yeah.
everything from helping in an accounting office during tax season to waiting tables to working in retail during the holiday season. And so, I mean, the other thing is it gave me this real opportunity to explore a lot of different avenues
Yeah.
and to continue to define sort of who I was, but also what relationship I wanted to have with work.
Yeah.
And so it was really interesting to me that I settled on the field of marketing. One of the things I say to my students, the process of figuring out why people drink soda or what they watch on TV is not that different than clinical research. You have
Yeah.
to start by defining a problem. You have to do background work. You have to have a hypothesis. You have to set up a test. You got
Mhm.
to gather data. You got to interpret the data. And I think that day when I was sitting in the coffee shop, um, it was just really refreshing for me when I
Where
made
was
the
that
list of
coffee shop, by the way? Where was that coffee shop?
Coffee by Design on Congress Street, Portland, Maine. They had just
Oh,
opened up and I was drinking hazelnut coffee, which I loathe now, but back in the day I used to like.
that's funny.
I went to a school, my first undergraduate career was at the University of Vermont, and Green Mountain Coffee Roasters was, very popular at UVM, and their hazelnut and French vanilla were our two most popular study flavors. So I've lost my appetite for hazelnut, or my taste for hazelnut rather, but at Coffee by Design that day, it was just funny looking through the list and going,
Yeah.
wait a minute, I could be a circus performer and I could get all of these.
So
Thank
to
you.
that question, did when you went into chemistry, when you went into research, did you at that point want to work with people, or was that something you discovered through the process of?
I I think that's something I discovered through the process.
Okay.
One of the things that was interesting, I worked at Maine Medical Center, which is a teaching hospital.
Yeah.
So I got opportunities to participate in education of people ranging from phlebotomists to people who are studying to be research scientists. And I like that. We had an apprenticeship program in the division of the lab that I worked in where people would come and do a clinical year.
Yeah.
I got to work with students in their clinical year. So it was all of those interactions that became interesting to me. Some of the pathologists that I assisted their research, interacting with the doctors and understanding their interpretation of tests, like all of those interactive elements were what I liked most about the job. The funniest thing, I in high school was good in the sciences, which is how I ended up studying science. I'm a first generation college student on my father's side of the family, so first person in the family to go to college. And I think my parents, when I was in high school, they always wanted me to excel at math or science
Right.
because they were like, that's how you get a good job.
Sure.
And, and I had an acclimate for the sciences and I enjoyed them. And college though is funny. I often tell my students this anecdote that you can be good at something and still fail, and that's okay. So I was really good at chemistry. I was a failure at organic chemistry. So I failed it the first time I took it. I had to take the same class again, and all I could muster was a D plus, which was enough to pass the course and keep going. But so to me, that's the other funny thing about science. It really helped me learn a lot about failure. We do experiments all the time where we fail, and failure is just part of it. One of the things I try to instill in my students, particularly in my entrepreneurship classes,
Oh,
is that we can't fear failure. Failure is part of success. It's not the opposite of success. And it's one of the best ways for us to learn. And, I think we live in, such a judgmental society where we look
oh,
down at failure and we're critical of it and it's a bad thing. But the reality is, most successes are just you start, then you fail some, and then you find success. So, helping renegotiate that relationship, like one of the things that for me was easier because of the sciences is we fail a lot in science.
yeah,
And, it also helped me with this whole notion around experimentation. Like I'm a big fan acting in order to learn. And I'm
yeah,
not such a big fan of planning and planning and planning and planning and planning. I think we're taught in too many fields to spend too much time planning. I think it's important to plan, and there certainly is a role in terms of planning and overall success. But if we spend more time experimenting and acting in order to learn, we can take in information faster. It allows us to be a little more creative in what we're doing and innovative in what we're doing. So, the interesting thing for me, a lot of things I learned in the sciences, I was able to bring with me. But when I really was thinking about it, it wasn't test tubes that I liked. It
right.
was the interactions I had with other scientists and
Oh, yeah. So
patients and doctors that
yeah,
really
so that
got
actually
me.
brings us back to the question that was kind of a nice transition to when you talked earlier about how you teach quote unquote off the curriculum of marketing as off the curriculum meaning compassion, empathy, the skills of life, other things that are part of this model around experimentation and failure. Where how did these experiences, this variety of different jobs, this variety of different experiences in that transition, these different chapters influence your teaching around these topics?
Absolutely. So, early on in life, like anyone, the first business I started, which was a consulting practice,
Right.
I had a lot of fear of failure. And then I got so overwhelmed by all the work I had to do to keep myself and money and keep a couple people employed. I just had to develop a relationship with it. And, in the early days, it was probably not a healthy relationship. I tried to avoid failure or was in denial and came up with excuses. And then at some point, I was like, wait a minute, I'm learning a lot. I'm actually, my most important learnings and the work that I'm doing every day are coming from the things that I'm failing at. And, instead of just reinforcing all the things I'm good at, it's better for me to think about the things that I'm not so good at and what can I do differently next time and how can I develop a more healthy relationship with failure. I had some great mentors. When I was getting my MBA, I took a market research practicum course and I got partnered with a woman who owned a small firm here in Portland named Nikki Kagan. And she got assigned what I thought at the time was the most dreadful job ever. So the state of Maine Department of Tourism had hired a prior researcher to go out to figure out, well, what did the ecosystem at the time really need? So what did businesses need to support tourism efforts so that the state could develop these marketing campaigns? So the person that did that research chose to do interviews, interviewed 338 people. I remember the number because we had to go re-interview all 338 people because the original researcher didn't do the same interview twice. So she had 338 interviews that were all over the place. And of course, you couldn't make any sense of what you learned. So somehow Nikki Kagan's company decided to take on this project of going through all 338 interviews, coding them, figuring out what questions we didn't ask, going back, doing all the interviews again to ask the questions, recoding all that data, standardizing it, and trying to create something meaningful. And I got hired as her research assistant. That was my practicum in the last year of my MBA program. And, I remember often saying to her, wow, that person really failed. Wow, this was a failure. That was a failure. Like just looking at the downside of the work that we had to do.
Yeah.
I think Nikki would often try to reframe my thinking. and say, well, look at the opportunity here. Here's this question we didn't ask that we now can ask. Here's this trend we found that we might have missed if we asked all of the same questions. So, she was really good at, I don't want to say she was a glass half full person, because I don't often get into the, when it comes to things like failure and success, half full or half empty.
Yeah.
But I more like to say, okay, what's the opportunity? And she was really good at seeing the opportunity and helping me see the opportunity.
Yeah.
And so, that was something I picked up at that point along the way. When I finally decided, so long story short, she ended up relocating to Europe. And so she left some of her clients behind, and I got to pick them up, which is how I started my first consulting business. So, just grateful for the mentorship, but also, she got me going. After a couple years of consulting as a young consultant and someone who was too busy, I got very tempted to go take a corporate job. And someone that we'd worked with at the Department of Tourism was working in a large direct response marketing company here in Maine, and called me up one day and said, "Hey, Richard, I've gone to work for this company. They're either going to go bankrupt next year or they're going to be the biggest financial success ever in the state of Maine. Can you come join us? Because the company currently has 7 marketing departments and I want it to have one." And so anyway, the people that I were employing in my consulting company, I paid it forward, sold the clients and the business off to them so they could continue on their journey, and took what I learned and went into this corporate job, which of course ended up being the largest bankruptcy reorganization in the state of Maine history at the time. So it was a roller coaster for 2 years. I learned a lot about entrepreneurship. The guy who started that company was perhaps one of the most entrepreneurial individuals I ever met, but never really understood how a business functions. I had arrived at a company that had been in business for a long time, that was making hundreds of millions of dollars and didn't understand cash flow, for example. And so it was just interesting being in this really like high stakes environment. And it was a roller coaster ride. I, did it for my 2 years. I stayed through the bankruptcy reorganization, which we were successful for. But that to me was another set of learnings I got to take along with me.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I've been grateful for, almost every job I've had has been a great learning opportunity where I've been able to, compile and synthesize the things that have been lessons along the way. And I'm able to bring those things to my teaching,
Yeah.
and part of it is, one of the things I think that's interesting, we often don't spend a lot of time talking about the absurdity of life. I remember when I was at that direct response marketing company, we had this funny situation where we were selling these dolls, which were like predecessor dolls to American Girl dolls. And we were also selling this golf program that came with this customizable set of golf balls. And somehow in manufacturing, they had manufactured the dolls without their eyeballs. And so we sent the dolls out, horrified a bunch of kids because the
Yeah.
dolls, come out of the box and open up their eyelids and there's like these empty sockets. And so anyway, we figured out the problem, and, I thought customer service could handle what needed to happen. Well, long story short, we somehow got a bunch of wires crossed and we sent a set of 2 golf balls to everyone that had a doll. And we sent 2 doll eyeballs to people that were supposed to get their golf balls that month in their subscription program. I mean, and it was like, I can laugh at it now, but I mean, literally in the moment, I was like, this is the end of the world.
Yeah.
And it's so funny to see my response to it back then.
Yeah.
Now, of course, one of the things I like to say, like when we're talking about businesses, when they have problems, you know, it's sometimes it's maybe not the best expression, but I often like to say, okay, no one's going to die in this situation. This isn't life threatening. We'll figure it out. Like one of the things that I think is unfortunate in American culture, we have a real tendency to catastrophize things.
Yeah.
And catastrophe, in some ways, to me, is the opposite of compassion. When we just turn everything into this total disaster and it's stressful and it takes way too much out of us and, clouds our judgment, like it's all those things that are in some ways different than a compassion based practice, where you can forgive yourself for a mistake. Like, when I think back about myself as a young corporate manager, I think I fired 3 people over the eyeball golf ball incident and, got the whole customer service and distribution group together and probably yelled and screamed at them. And, I would not do that now. So to me, I mean, the other thing that's been a benefit is, you know, I have been able to acknowledge my own mistakes along the way. And some of that comes from, I teach this wonderful course called Creative Strategies for Entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
One of the things I love about this course, we use business models as the backbone of the course. So we're talking about empathy mapping and SWOT and the business model canvas. But at the same time, we're really developing an intentional creativity practice. So we're talking about the skill of empathy and creativity and reflection and play and experimentation. And we're doing things to support building those skills. And, out of the development of this class, like I've developed my own reflection practice, and I spend time every week reflecting on sort of what's happening now. But sometimes I go back into those moments in time and go, hey, remember that time you fired those 3 people?
Yeah.
Was that the wisest thing to have done? Could you have done something differently? What would you do now?
I was going to ask you
And
that question. What would you do now?
I mean, now I would just say, look, we made a mistake. Let's let people know we're sorry and let's fix the mistake. Which to me is like this interesting, you know, evolution in thought. Like, when companies make mistakes, I think sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, who did what wrong?
Mhm.
And we need someone to blame. And the reality is that when we get into that mode, then we often don't understand what went wrong. And I think when you can model the whole second chance approach,
Mhm.
um, I think it's helpful to the people involved, but to everyone to
Yeah.
recognize that, okay, if I do something wrong, maybe I should disclose it sooner than later because I'm not going to get fired.
So that
Or
to validate what you're saying though, but it's important and kind of along other thing you said. So it also requires a culture of learning and growth and self responsibility. Also, in order for that to exist,
absolutely,
it's they both need to coexist, and not in order for that to flourish. Right?
absolutely. I mean, I'm in education and I have students who cheat.
Hmm.
That's just a fact when you're in education.
How do you manage that? Out of curiosity.
Um, I give everyone one pass. But the thing that I do, which I think is often the lesson, when I catch you plagiarizing or I catch you cheating, I make you write me and the class an apology letter because I want you to acknowledge that you did something that was not good and wasn't fair to the other students in the classroom. When I think about the classroom, I really look at the classroom as a learning community.
Yeah.
And, I don't look at it as I'm the expert at the front of the room and you're all there because, you want me to tell you what you should know. I want to participate in the learning. I have a colleague, Gary Palin, who I love, who sometimes calls this teaching from the back of the classroom. Like he loves to do disruptive things like go in today and say, hey, today we're going to talk about how you finance a business. I'm going to flip the classroom around. I'm going to sit in the back and someone's going to stand up and teach. And so, it requires that people be prepared, but you have to create a culture in the classroom where if someone's not prepared, they can say, sorry, I'm not prepared today. And it's not a punitive thing. It's more a formative thing where you get to go, okay, everyone else is showing up and expecting us. We sort of have this informal contract of how we're
Yeah.
going to function as a community. I need to live up to my commitment. And that to me is the interesting thing, like sending students directly to the conduct board the first time you catch them cheating and having them sanctioned in some way or punished in some way. I'm not really sure you learn the lesson. You might, but you might not.
Let me ask you
Asking,
a question. I'm curious. So, of those students that have gone through that exercise of writing a apology letter to you and to their classmates in particular,
Mhm.
repeat offense rate would you get?
Probably very low. I
Okay.
mean, I often don't have these students, I don't often catch them cheating a second time. I mean, the other thing, and this is all anecdotal, I'm interested in the sort of informal, convenient sample of my own realm of experience.
So,
But, I in this area, but I do have students write to me years later
Mm.
and say, hey, when you caught me cheating in class that time,
That's
I just had to do something where, I was auditing books and I could have easily just waved a wand and fixed a mistake, but I realized that would be wrong, or I was going to, engage in this HR practice that wasn't quite right. I mean, that to me is the most important part. Like, the punishing you is the least important part. It's the being able to reflect on sort of what happened and make sense of what you could do different next time. I think is really important. And there are lots of folks in the academy who probably really disagree with me, and that's okay. I also think it's good that there are a bunch of approaches in the university setting, but
So to that point, I'm curious because the university educational format of these different points of view, styles, methodologies, it's a good kind of micro environment, if I were to term, of the broader society. How are you seeing that being effectively reconciled, integrated? How is it changing what I'll call the educational framework for the future of business?
yeah, well, I mean, in some ways it is, and in some ways it isn't. I
Right.
mean, that's the fascinating thing to me about the different forms and shapes that education can take. I look at myself as someone who's very experimental.
Yeah.
And then I have some colleagues that are a lot less experimental and very traditional in their frame. I think it's important to be exposed to both because you're going to encounter both in the world. I also think you've got to figure out often how to navigate both of these situations. One of the things that's funny, one of my favorite colleagues, he is very conservative. I'm very liberal.
Okay.
We don't share very many views about issues related to politics, but we're great friends and we're great colleagues. And we can talk about polarizing topics without getting mad at one another. We can talk about how we might reach a compromise in the middle.
We need more of
Um,
that in society.
and we need a lot more of that in society. And interestingly, I mean, we often model it for our students who are in disbelief that we can be such good friends. Because I think in society, we're just bombarded by you got to take one side or the other.
It
And
didn't used to
everything,
be that way. It
it
actually
didn't
was
used to
not
be.
that way. Right.
No, it was not, but it is that way today, unfortunately. And to me, like, no binary has ever been interesting. It's all the stuff
Okay.
that's in between that's the interesting stuff. And you know, and teaching students how to navigate that can be fascinating. I mean, the other day I teach in the honors program as well, and it's a school of business at the University of Southern Maine, and I'm teaching a course in writing this semester. And we were going to the library to do some research because we're about to write a critical thought essay. And we were talking about cognitive bias. And, I was using an example of my own cognitive bias. And one of the things that I think is so fascinating, three students came up to me after class and they're like, one of the things we love about you as a professor, you're not calling out other people when it comes to these things.
Yeah.
You always bring it back to yourself and you give us a way in which you navigated, negotiated, thought about, reflected on each of these experiences. And you're not doing it in an egotistical way. You're doing it to say, hey, here's a time when I really wanted something to be true in a research project I was doing. And I myself was able to ignore the evidence that refuted what I wanted to be true and only found the pieces of research that supported what I wanted to be true. And I think, the more we can share our own human experience,
Yeah.
the better it is. Like me talking about politicians or economists doing it in this abstract sense, I just think it makes it harder for people to apply it to their own life. And one of the things that I think is interesting, I'm a big fan of the sort of modeling and mirroring approach,
Yeah.
where if someone is like, well, I don't know how to have a challenging conversation, all right, let's then try to have one right now. Let's just dialogue it out and see how it goes. And it might be great, it might be terrible, but if it's great or it's terrible, at least we have another data point and we can continue to think about it.
So let me ask this question. This is a question I've never asked this interview, but I'm very curious about it. You, over the course of your 9 years or so teaching full time, and even more than that, have you noticed a change or certain changes in style, communication, beliefs, values between what I'll call the millennials and this emerging generation of Gen Z as they approach their careers?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Gen Z has a much different relationship with work than any of the other age-based cohorts that have come before them. I think living and experiencing, if we just look at the increase in social media and the ways in which we connect and the things we can experience and these augmented and virtual reality programs we can now engage with, it allows us to expand the way in which we want to live. The other day I was with my godson who's 22 and he's living in New York City, and he's trying to figure out where he's going to finish his last year of college. And we went to college in Connecticut, and then he spent a semester in Paris and was like, wait a minute, a big city is a lot nicer than this cute little sleeper neighborhood in Connecticut. So now he's in New York working two jobs. And we went out and grabbed a coffee at this local coffee shop that he likes to go to in Lower Manhattan. But it was the thing that was fascinating to me was to watch how much he appreciated coffee.
Hmm.
Like, he clearly is spending more time thinking about things in life. I think what often challenges us when we get into the sort of baby boomers and the Gen Xer zone, we want people to like things like money because we want the economy to keep thriving. And, we want to save the planet, but really we want someone else to save the planet. And of course I'm overgeneralizing, but
Okay.
but it's interesting that, to me, I'm like, I'm glad there are 22-year-olds in the world that can appreciate coffee and like smelling it and tasting it and can describe the experience of what it's like to drink it. Like, they're not just showing up at Starbucks and, chugging down their $5 latte at the speed of light squared. And so, it's this different value system. I also think a lot of folks in Gen Z think that we failed them in some ways if we just look at the state of the environment and the state of society and the fact that we are still struggling with issues of racism and sexism and genderism and all the isms that exist.
Yeah.
It's sort of interesting that, in some ways we may have, we might not be leaving the best situation in society and on the planet. But on the other hand, it's also interesting to see people, particularly younger people, be more thoughtful about some of these things.
I was going to
Now,
say that I think just to chime in on that, because I think I actually reflected quite a bit on this question. In fact, I think this topic came up when we were in our panel, because I think that in many ways, what I'll call the luxury of being able to reflect on all the isms and to put energy and resources into actually changing the isms, as
mhm,
opposed to the structural basis of survival and what generations. I mean, I think about my grandparents, my great grandparents, the stories I heard about, so many people living the level of subsistence and what that went for so many people in society, to where
mhm,
we are now in the midst of relative abundance and luxury for so many more people. And even from a global, and the data, we talked about this too. The data supports the fact that globally we're far more, vital society in terms of people's access to basic services and food and water and shelter, the basic human needs. And so the fact that we're moving up this human, you know, self-actualization pyramid in big ways, that this is the level of discussion in our culture, speaks to progress, actually. And so it's a really
absolutely.
fascinating, like, point of conflict, that people's experiences don't necessarily reflect reality. Uh,
Yeah. Well, and I also, one thing I get frustrated by is things related to topics like voting. Like, I have a lot of opinionated students in class about things like we need younger politicians and this policy needs to change. And then, of course, I love to say, okay, how many people were 18 last year during the election? Oh, all of you. How many people voted? Oh, two of you. All right. So, we know how democracy works.
yeah,
If we don't, let's have a
okay.
conversation about it. Get out and vote.
Yeah.
If you want to come and replace the old politicians, you got to vote so that you can replace the old politicians. And so I think that becomes this interesting thing is, you know, on the one hand, I think Gen Z is so much more aware. On the other hand, they still suffer from some of the things every age-based cohort has
Well,
suffered from, like we don't vote. And so we often don't find a way to use our voice and use our opinion in a way that could
yeah.
potentially start to move the bar.
And I will say this is kind of a good kind of emphasis on our conversation, which I really appreciated your wisdom in sharing here. That is the basis of Rebels with the Heart. It's the idea of putting heartfulness into action. The idea of
Mhm.
it requires actual motivation and movement and action to change and progress and to influence and to learn and to adjust and to experiment and to do it with a level of heart and respect and true inclusion of people's voices in that process. That is how we create differences and create progressive change. So
Absolutely. And that's the thing, like, how do you get people to action? I
yeah,
teach a course in sustainable business, and one of the things the students are shocked about, I have them all go out and pick a business that they think is practicing the triple bottom line, and they come to class and discuss it. And then we start taking them apart one at a time because I'm like, that's a good plan, that's a good plan, that's a good plan, that's a good plan, that's a good plan. None of these businesses are sustainable because plans are just words. You can only be sustainable based on the actions you're taking. And to me, I think that's so fascinating. That's one of the things too that I try to in my students get them to think about, which is, all the stuff that you're doing in social media and all the stuff you're doing to get people connected. It's all good because it's laying a foundation, but you got to get people doing things.
doing
We can't just be talking about them over and over and over again and getting mad because nothing's changing. The way things change is through action. So
we agree on
words,
that. I think it's a perfect
exactly.
way to end this cohesive conversation. Richard, really a pleasure. How can our listeners engage with you, connect with you, learn more about your work?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You can also search Richard Bilodeau at the University of Southern Maine's website, usm.maine.edu. And you can find me on Facebook, but that's the only social media platform I troll because I'm old school at this point.
Awesome. And you also have an event coming up, I believe, that may be worthwhile sharing about as well.
Yeah, so we run a leadership institute at the University of Southern Maine called the Hussey Leadership Institute. We're in our 6th year, and it's a really interesting um, experience. We every year have a theme, and we try to get local, regional, and national speakers involved. This year, our theme is disrupting your own thinking about how you lead. And we are going to be talking about bringing empathy back to leadership, how we can use compassion and innovation to get off the doom loops we get stuck on, how we can find harmony in difficult situations. Basically, how can we really reimagine our own selves as leaders and what might some best practices look like? So, if you reach out to me, I'd be glad to get you connected to the Institute. It's virtual the week of April 24th at the lunch hour on the East Coast, noon to 1. And it usually is a lot of fun. We end up having these really engaging conversations, probably very similar to what you've been doing with this program.
Lovely. Well, Richard, thank you again for sharing your voice, your heart with our audience today, and looking forward to seeing you soon.
Take care. Thanks.